Good evening. Welcome to everyone. My name is Deborah Grayson. I work for the Media Reform Coalition, and I'm here to chair today's event on journalism and personal stakes. The Media Reform Coalition has spent the last decade campaigning for a democratic and accountable media, not one owned and serving the interests of a handful of billionaires. This event tonight is a kind of teaser for our upcoming Media Democracy Festival, which will be in London at Birkbeck on March 25th on Saturday from 11 till 5:30. If you're in the UK and around in that part of the world and want to join us, you can find details about that on mediareform.org.uk. It's looking to be a really great programme. We've got a keynote from Zara Sultana, sessions on the future of the BBC, on cultural responses to the culture wars, about the relationship between media and unions. So please do make it along if you can. The Media Reform Coalition's vision is for a completely transformed media system, one that is democratic, accountable, independent, and for everyone. This would obviously mean a massive transformation in what it means to be a media worker. Today's event is all about where journalism is currently at and where we think it should be going. Journalism and the role of journalists is currently in a transition phase. There's been a huge loss of secure, well-paid jobs within commercial media. And this has also coincided with the growth of social media platforms, which allow journalists to build much more direct relationships and personal brands with audiences. So we've seen something of the rise of the influencer journalist, which isn't something that was so possible, say, 10 or 20 years ago. Within this, I think we're seeing increasing amounts of personal storytelling, for example, in genres like investigative podcasts. I mean, listening to someone for many hours can be a very intimate experience, and the genre kind of invites that. The narrative structure often frames the process as a personal heroic journey of discovery by the journalist. And in some ways, this really challenges traditional ideas of good journalism. If the traditional model says, trust me because of my training or my relationship with publishers or institutions, this new model says, trust me because you feel like you know me as an individual. And this seems like potentially a significant challenge to ideas of journalistic objectivity or the professional status of the journalist. At the same time, this idea of kind of journalism as a personal journey can clearly have very different stakes. It is very different to care about whether the journalist gets to tell a great story or build their career versus caring that a marginalised community that they're part of receives recognition or an injustice they have suffered is addressed. Success and failure mean very different things in these scenarios, as well as the vulnerability and exposure experienced by the journalist. So, what is good journalism today? What could it be in the future? And where do the personal and the political sit within that? Here to discuss this topic today, we have Hamza Syed joining us from New York. Hamza is an investigative reporter and the co-host of the serial productions and New York Times podcast, The Trojan Horse Affair. And we have Shirish Kulkarni. Shirish is an independent journalist, researcher, and community organiser whose work focuses on the intersections between journalism, innovation, inclusion, and art. So Hamza, if you want to kick off by telling us a bit about where you're at now. By the end of the Trojan Horse Affair podcast, you're saying, I'm not sure if I want to be a professional journalist, and I wonder how you're feeling about the profession now, and particularly whether you want your work in the future to be as personal as that podcast is. I listened back to it recently, and it's really striking how much you reveal about yourself and your family and your friends, especially as your co-host, Brian Reed, mostly maintains his professional boundaries. So do you have any reflections about this a year on from the podcast coming out?
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Reflections as far as journalism is concerned, I feel it's in a worse state than even I had imagined, to be honest, before I got involved with it. And that's largely based on the experience of putting out a piece of journalism into the world. I think it was a privilege, and it's also, quite a unique vantage point to study, the health of your field when you've actually contributed to it, and have some ideas about how journalism is treated. And I can report back to the people listening that journalism doesn't stand a chance in the current climate. It does not stand a chance. It's almost impossible to put out something and have it be treated seriously. Like I, I I don't know to what extent the podcasting industry or genre is huge in Britain. I kind of was familiar with Zero. I was familiar with the American exports in that industry, and obviously made one of my own over here as well. So I don't know to what extent like the optics of the podcast was the reason why the Trojan Horse suffered, because I don't think people grasped that a podcast is probably one of the most accurate and robust piece of journalism, especially investigative podcast, there is out there. I would wager no other piece of journalism goes through as much rigor and fact checking as our work. We have full-time fact checkers assigned to it. We have a whole standards division assigned to it. We have lawyers assigned to it. Years of work, every single bit of script, every single bit of tape, every single bit of evidence, every single bit that we gather and use as our reporting material is looked over by tons and tons of people, including when we come to recording our audio. You know, it is scrutinized to that degree. And so, you put something out there that I just think, as far as journalism is concerned, it is one of the most careful pieces of work you could put together. And then the response to that is it's put on equal weight and merit as frivolous opinion pieces that haven't been fact checked, that haven't been robustly put together, that haven't gone through the same editorial process. And in the eyes of the public, there's an equivalence there. The one piece can negate the other. So, based on that experience, it really does demoralize you as an investigative reporter, because your work is long and arduous. It takes years for you to put your thing together. And when the response is that it could be undone with something that has, been very casually clobbered together and put out there, and have the same impact and bearing on the public, it does discourage you from embarking on another adventure like that and putting together another story for the benefit of the public. So journalism is in a bad state, and journalism literacy is in a bad state. Like I think there's just a basic diligence that needs to happen, where people need to know what they're looking at when they're looking at a piece of news. And so, yeah, my opinions of journalism haven't changed. They got more severe in terms of like what I think its value is. As far as, sorry, I'm gonna let this FedEx truck go past. As far as putting yourself in the story, again, it's a judgment call. It's a judgment call. I'm not saying it was the idea all along with the Trojan Horse to be so personal. And again, maybe it's just a byproduct of the actual medium in which we were operating, podcasting, where you have, you spend hours and hours and hours on the road recording, and so naturally, you will settle into conversations as yourself. And I know Brian was more aware of that as a possible feature of the podcast, because it was my first piece of journalism. And so I think he was very piqued, especially at the beginning, he was very piqued about this idea of like this journalism student doing this work for the first time, and what's that experience like alongside the actual investigation that we were doing. And so he was documenting the whole experience. And so we had a lot of material, a lot of interesting conversations. I'd made mistakes, which we were going to reflect on in the series. And it would have been very odd, I think, for us to, for example, have had 5 episodes of a podcast, and then the 6th one begins with a big meditation between Brian and I about journalism and point of view, and whether you're allowed to express anything. Like, that would have been a really weird scene for us to kind of drag you into suddenly, when you have no context for this conversation, or this like kind of mentality that was developing, or even a ideology clash that was at play. So we had to create some space for that. We had to a certain extent, include a storyline that involved us. And honestly, I would wager anyone to tell me that it didn't make the piece more honest. What did you think when you heard us talking so openly at the top of episode 6? Did you suddenly lose faith in us, or did you suddenly think, actually, this is more revealing than I would expect most journalists to speak? And for me, actually, it's one of the other objective facts that gets ignored in most journalism stories, is what does the journalists themselves believe? Why are they interested in the story, or why are they covering it? It never gets addressed, it never gets talked about, but is that not a fact that the public should be aware of? In keeping with your ideas about impartiality and objectivity, let me know who this reporter is. Those are details we should know. So I had no qualms about doing it. I'll do it again. It didn't discourage me from doing it again. Like I know it set us up for very easy attack pieces, which was kind of the downside to it. The thing that I was worried about and trying to kind of mitigate against is the more of us you put in here, the easier you give authorities and others to ignore the reporting and just focus on you as a person. And so that is what happened, sadly. But I think that will continue to happen, whether you're honest with the public or not, whether you include bits of yourself in the reporting or not. I think that will always happen. People will find a way to sidestep the facts and evidence and focus on something else. And so, I don't think you should having decided to do that, I would do it again. I'd rather be honest and upfront with people than hold something back and have it be, spoken about regardless, whether it's part of the piece or not.
Thank you so much in that already. Shirish, how did you connect with the Trojan Horse Affair personally and journalistically? What did it tell you about where journalism and especially investigative podcasting is at right now?
Yeah, well, thanks again for inviting me. I mean, I think there is so much in what Hamza just said, and I'm a lot older than him, but so much of that. I mean, for me, the personal and journalistic are the same. I'm not embarrassed at all about saying that I became a journalist in a sense for activist reasons, but that activism is I just want the world to be a better place for me and society and the people I care about. And I happen to think that journalism is one way of making the world a better place. Now, I used to think that all journalists became journalists for that reason. And actually, I've been terribly disabused of that notion. I'm just a naive idealist, even at sort of 52. But really, I was really, really struck by how many parallels there were. So people who've listened to the podcast will know that one of the sort of striking images at the beginning is this kind of doom-laden panorama voiceover, which talks about a particular area of Bradford called Manningham, and actually inspired some of the people in Birmingham to go into the work they did and stuff. So my student project was a documentary in Manningham Primary School in Bradford. And this is a lot earlier. So this is like 95. And already then, I'm not saying like I uncovered systemic racism in 95. No one else had realized it existed. But already then, I'm not Muslim, but I could already see then, the way the discourse was going around Muslims and Muslim schools. And we did a story in Manningham Primary School around how all the kids were Muslim, so they were just doing stuff which made Muslim kids feel comfortable. And there was already this kind of build up of kind of negative discourse around that. And then that's really, in a way, some of the themes of that have really kind of followed me through my career. So one of the reasons I'm freelance now, I've been freelance for nearly 9 years, now 10 years now, is because I would never use the word constructive dismissal, because that has a lot of real life legal connotations. However, I used to work at a national and international broadcaster, and I started asking questions about systemic racism, and then suddenly I didn't have a job. But I would never use the word constructive dismissal, certainly not in a public space. But what that was around was, some of you will remember that sort of mid-2000s, we were still kind of in war on terror territory. And what would happen is, every other day, some brown guys in the West Midlands would be arrested. By coincidence, Sky News's cameras would be there, ready to catch the arrest, because these are all like just, big publicity stunts for the police, right? What we didn't cover was the fact that 2 days later, they'd be released without charge, almost without exception, these guys. And I used to say in the morning meeting, guys, we've either got to cover the release or we don't cover the arrest, because otherwise we're making it very dangerous. Just creating a very dangerous narrative in society. And I was told that's not how journalism works. That's not how news values work. And I was like, no. That's not how your news values work. News values aren't some tablets of stone. that come down from God, and that's the only way to do things. This is a narrative you've constructed. These are totally subjective views, and they're constructed because you're all white middle-aged men who live in London and don't have to deal with the kind of issues that other people are facing, and that the issues that brown men in the West Midlands are facing. And so all those issues have followed me throughout my career, 25 plus years now. And as Hamza said, they have not got better. If anything, they're getting worse. I mean, you look at things like GB News. Like, GB News is a bad faith enterprise, but the launch editor of GB News is now the editor of news programs at BBC News. And so these are troubling things to me when we're talking about when those people will claim objectivity, right? They'll go, I'm an objective journalist, I'm doing, BBC style, but yet there was over there, or at TRT in Turkey, or wherever. So these are troubling times where objectivity is used as a hammer to hit us, but it doesn't really apply to them.
Yeah, and we'll definitely, some questions about objectivity would be good to explore next. So, Hamza, you say in the Trojan Horse Affair that for you, the purpose of journalism is to have positive outcomes. And there's a conversation between you and Brian, and he says, oh, you can't expect to have outcomes, you'll just be disappointed. And you say, well, I don't see what the point is of doing this if you're not trying to do that. And you also make a comment at one point about approaching your work as a Muslim first and as a journalist second. So how does this relate for you to ideas that journalists should be objective about the stories they report on? And I also wondered whether you have any thoughts, given that you're in the US now, about whether there are any differences in the conversation on objectivity in the UK versus the US.
I'm going to need you guys to kind of loop me in on what is happening with the conversation about objectivity in Britain. Because I can tell you in the US, it is being discussed. It's being discussed in the most serious of publications. There is a movement, and I'm not sure if this is exactly true, but I remember it being true that it all really came to the fore around the time of the George Floyd murder. And around that moment, there was a reckoning in a bunch of newsrooms that would include the New York Times and others about how reporters who were from a minority background got to report on such events and such cases, to what extent they could express themselves and their emotions. And obviously, it seemed particularly galling to ask them not to have any reaction to something like that, And since then, I know there has been entire school of journalism thought that's been developing, some really serious actors and motivators who are trying to normalize this, because it is normal for journalists to be humans and have thoughts and feelings. And so it's not that radical a thought. What I find curious and don't necessarily even theoretically agree with is that any of that has any bearings on what people's conventional ideas of objectivity is. It has absolutely zero bearings. Who I am, what I feel, what I think, what I practice, what my background is, none of that has any bearings on what you might think objectivity is. Because objectivity, as I understand it, and again, jump in, please tell me if I'm wrong, is you are obligated as a reporter to report out on all the different perspectives and arguments about a specific situation, include to whatever extent you can verify what people are saying, and make sure that you're not approaching it just from one specific perspective or point of view. Agreed. What I believe or what I think isn't going to dictate how I practice my journalism. I'm still compelled to go and speak to everyone who has something to say about a specific event. What I'm not compelled to do, and I think what quickly gets muddled up with objectivity, is include everyone's bizarre take or experience or feeling or thought. If I haven't done the work to go verify, there's nothing for me to say that I have to include this. How do I know if it's true? Why would I give it equal weighting as if it is true and confuse the truth if I've gone and actually fact-checked and verified that stuff? So that is a very simplistic and kind of a stupid interpretation of what objectivity is, in my opinion. It does not mean you go collect every single point of view and express it equally. No, go collect every single point of view and then do your work. do some due diligence, go find out if it's true or not. And then the bits that aren't true, I want you to qualify it before you include it. If you choose to include it, I want you to say, this official said this to me, but actually it turned out none of that was true. Now, if you don't have time to do that, if you don't have time to go and actually verify what people are telling you, then to be fair, there's a conversation that needs to be had. What do you do with this point of view? Well, humble yourself. Make sure you're clear with the audience that, like, I haven't done the work here, so I don't know if any of this is true. Don't give me a report that feels finished, that feels like you've gone and actually like done the work and assembled the truth to some extent, and there's some disagreement around what the truth is, but you're just telling me what the disagreement is. No, that's the wrong impression. You don't know what the truth is. You don't know what the truth is. Your pivot is, I'm just going to assemble 6 people who have different opinions of what the truth might be, and I'm going to broadcast that. That's my work as a journalist. No. Your work is to find out what the truth is. And I wish journalism just front and centered that idea again, that we are trying to discover what the truth is. That's what our responsibility is, and where we fell short in that, or where we fall short in that, we're going to then be honest with our viewers and say, here are 6 opinions, but none of them we know the truth about. And so, take each one with a pinch of salt. That's one thing. So who I am, and with me saying I'm going to be a Muslim first and everything else after that, to be honest, it's a comment that was in response to how I was approaching Trojan Horse to begin with. I was paranoid from day one about the accusations that were bound to be leveled against me because I was a brown guy from Birmingham, a Muslim. Then I'm doing the story about brown people from Birmingham who are Muslims. All right, well, where's that going to go? You know where that's going to go. You know what the accusation is going to be, what the challenge is going to be for people to listen to my reporting and not have a thought about it or a feeling about it. So to try to get ahead of that, I decided I would just neuter myself. I would essentially just be like a vessel. I will turn up to these rooms bereft of any kind of persona. I will sit there like a stenographer. I will listen, I will document, and then ultimately I'll assemble some kind of story from this. And that's what my job apparently was. Well, that was a useless exercise. It would have been time wasted, resources wasted. It would have been uninformative. It would have meant nothing. It would have been as confused as everything else you've read about the Trojan Horse before the podcast came along. And I wasn't interested in that. And for me, making that statement was just reminding myself that, like, hey, listen, there's a reason I got interested in this story. Who are you trying to kid? We make choices before the story gets anywhere near the public. We've made 1,000 choices about what's going to get near the public. Are you telling me that's not informed by who you are? And we're supposed to be the only ones who are uniquely trying to be kind of varied and vigilant for that and make sure none of our personal feelings inspire the stories that we look into or the reporting that we focus on. Come now. Why does everyone else get to do it but not us? So for me, that was a declaration of just like, no. All of you are making decisions every day about what you're choosing to focus on, what you're choosing to write about, who you're choosing to speak to. You think there's like an industry formula for the sources that you go speak to about a given situation? No. You'll make these choices yourself. You will construct your own investigation. You'll make your own decisions. Each of these decisions, whether you're aware of it or not, is coming from your point of view. So I was saying I'm doing that too. The difference is I'm going to do that openly because I need to be more transparent than other reporters, because I'm going to be charged first with the allegation of being biased. So I'm just going to do it openly. I'm going to include it in part of my stories. I'm going to make sure everyone hears the deliberation, so this was the decision making behind everything that we did. The same can be said for almost all the journalism that you experience every day. You don't know what went behind those reports. So that's kind of where I landed on this matter. Who you are has no bearings on the work that you do, as long as you go do the work. And actually, it's funny. Like I'd have thought this morning, knowing this talk was coming. Maybe I'm just rambling, by the way. Cut me off, because I will do this. I will go off a little tangents. But I'd have thought, I've always noticed that like journalists can kind of laugh off the accusation of being wrong, like being factually incorrect. That doesn't seem to bother them as much as being charged with being biased, and that includes their editors and proprietors. Like they would rather their reporter be accused of being wrong than be accused of being biased, right? Which I find just such a funny kind of like a way to organize this field of ours, that you would rather get things wrong than people know that you have a personality. It's really weird. But I was trying to think on that, like, why would that be? Why would people be so sensitive to having their reporters express themselves a bit more, or having the audience be a bit more aware of where their reporters come from? And I wonder if it's a reflection of just like the lack of diversity in the points of view of reporting. Because if every reporter was expressing where they're coming from, the public might quickly learn that they all come from the same place. So long as no one's open about who they are or what they believe, or like, what their agendas are, so long as no one's open about that, you would assume that everyone's just like an embodiment of the public. There's kind of the same kind of complexion to journalism as there are to general society. That's not true. That's not true at all. And you will know that within a day if every journalist was compelled to declare any interest or any kind of thoughts or feelings they have about a story they're reporting. You will quickly realize that most of your reporting is coming from one curated and closely guarded point of view. And so maybe that's why people are way more protective about this than they are about accuracy in journalism.
And I think that's sort of the most important thing, because I'm going to kind of 90% agree with Hamza and 10% disagree. And the bit where I disagree...
like that ratio. I like that ratio.
The 10% I disagree is I don't think any notion of objectivity stands up, actually, because we're always, as you say, the choice of stories we do is defined by who we are. So I actually haven't done many stories about being a person of colour. I don't know whether that's slightly deliberate as well, because I didn't want to fall into those kind of bear traps in a way. But, I was compelled when I started doing investigative journalism to do a story on the radicalisation of young people by the far right, because that was a narrative that was never being discussed. It was always Islamic radicalisation, right? And I was like, there is a hell of a lot of radicalisation of young people by the far right going on, and I'm going to do that. And no one else in the newsroom was going to do that story, right? Because it just didn't matter to them. And as you say in the podcast, Hamza, for this to change, someone would have to care about how Muslims are kind of treated in the discourse, right? And in a way, I was expressing that, I was manifesting that by, I care about this, so I'm going to do this story. And I've never pretend I was objective, but what I did pretend was I was bringing something different from all those other people that Hamza's talking about. And I think, again, this notion of objectivity is, there's at the center of this is an incredible hypocrisy in the journalism industry around these notions of objectivity. So, for example, if you work at the BBC or ITN or wherever, I've worked at all those major broadcasters, the thing that separates you from being an editor as opposed to a correspondent is an editor is expected to bring their personal interpretation. That's what they get paid for, to bring their personal interpretation. Now, that worked 30 years ago, maybe, because basically everyone who watched the news had the same view. Like, we are a much more diverse, not necessarily a more inclusive society, but a much more diverse society in the UK. And those people largely do not have any idea of the real life implications of a lot of the things they say to people who are different from them. It's a problem which exists all over the world. And actually, people have done this research in Sweden. I call it the Ealing problem in the UK. Like, a disproportionate number of people that make TV news live in Ealing. In Cardiff, near where I am, it's the Pontcanna problem. A disproportionate number of people live in Pontcanna. And in Sweden, actually, it's the Södermalm problem. So not only do 80% of Swedish journalists live in Stockholm, 80% of those journalists live in one suburb of Stockholm. And they have the same opinions because they're the same people, essentially. And so that works if everyone lives in Södermalm or everyone lives in Ealing, but they don't. And people have different views and people have different experiences. And journalism has different effects on them. And, lots of, even, the BBC or mainstream broadcasters, they're doing transphobic coverage, straight out transphobic journalism, and kind of then doubling down on it under the notion of objectivity. And it's like, that does not wash. Just because you personally are a transphobe and you think, I have the power to do a transphobic documentary, But that doesn't mean that's objective. It just means you are a transphobe.
And I think this loops back to some of what you were saying, Hamza, about, you know, having the time to do the work as well, because what, you know, as you know, journalistic conditions have deteriorated and people have to generate more and more stories in less and less time, actually, what are you going to default back to? Who are you going to be able to get a quote from in a hurry? Who are you, you know, you're actually going to rely ever more on your personal networks, on the people that you already know. I'm interested, Shirish, in hearing what you think. Like Hamza was saying, you're not sure actually where the conversation about objectivity is at in the UK. You know, Shirish, you and I are both part of a lot of spaces and conversations where we do hear people talking about other kinds of approaches like generative journalism or solutions journalism, which do have a real critique of objectivity. And yet, when you go into other spaces where people are talking about the need to protect public interest journalism or new forms of funding for it, there always seems to be a defaulting back to the idea that objective and impartial journalism is the marker of something being high quality and trustworthy. So I wonder, what do you think it would take for that critique of objectivity to actually really sink in? Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's sort of, what's the word? It's simple, but not easy. So the answer is simple, but it's not easy, and it's not going to happen. It's actually, you just have different people in the newsrooms who understand that there are different realities other than the Ealing reality or the Pontcanna reality or the Sodermalm. That is what it actually takes. Now, actually, there's nothing really going on in kind of legacy journalism that is going to change that very soon, because the truth is lots of legacy journalism is harming people and communities. And so if you're, you know, as I mentor a young Muslim woman in Swansea, you know, she talks regularly about picking up the paper with trepidation every day because, yeah, her community is going to be traduced in some new and horrible way. Why should she become a journalist? Like, what is she looking? What was she looking ahead to? Yeah, if she's going to go in and be the only Muslim woman in a newsroom. I mean, she actually has become a journalist, but has had pretty bad experiences. Luckily, she can look out for herself, and she's got hopefully people like me who can kind of look out for her as well. But that is tough, right? And like, it's not for everyone, and nor should it be for everyone. Like, I don't recommend people ask me, should I become a journalist? I do not recommend it. I say it's the very best job I could possibly have. I love my job, but it's flipping tough sometimes because you are fighting these battles every day. Yeah, and you're being told, when I left, a big national, international broadcaster, I did think maybe I am a shit journalist because that's what I was being told every day, essentially. Because, even if I brought up, this tells you what it's like. Even if I brought up a story about or from Wales, because I'm originally, I suppose, from Wales, you'd see the chorus of eye rolls go around the newsroom. And this is a national broadcaster, but there aren't any other Welsh people in that newsroom, so they don't care because they are living in a kind of such a narrow bubble. So to change those notions of objectivity, you're going to have to change the people, but it's a real chicken and egg scenario until people really engage with the substantive problem of inclusion rather than just sort of diversity. See the sneer I do when I talk about diversity, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, like, I remember there used to be like a romantic idea of what journalism was, which is that we're kind of for the people. We hold power to account for the people, and I love that just because it makes you feel like a hero. But actually, what the reality of is that it also gives you your kind of bearings in this work. Always remember what you're there for. You're there to serve the public, and every official you're sitting with, you're there to interrogate and scrutinize them for the benefit of the public. The stories that you're doing, in what way is this useful or beneficial to the public? That, for me, it came with a slant. It came with a bent. You are biased to the public. You are there they can't be in these rooms because they have no reason to be in these rooms, but you do. You get this title, you get this badge, you get to be called a journalist, and that qualifies you to go and ask these questions to officials. So essentially, your job is to recognize what the public are either suffering from or clamoring for, and go figure that out for them. That's what you're tasked to do. Um, Journalists have become the power. Like, journalists have become the power. That's a fact. They are as much a part of the establishment as the politicians. That's a fact. Now, you can say, there's a lot of things you can speculate for why that's come to be, including what we were talking about in terms of access. Access is how you get stories as a reporter. If you don't have the right to go speak to people because they don't want to talk to you, they have their own characters in the media who they'd rather trust because they trust to get a decent run from them. You know what I mean? They trust to be treated well by them. Then you would be struggling as a reporter, technically speaking. So I can see why that encourages people to be differential to power, to kind of trust them, to revere authority, because that essentially is your job. That's how you continue in your job. That's how you remain useful to your employer. Stuff like this needs to be understood for the public to recognize how to mitigate against that. And for example, having a right to information is talked about as a theoretical and allowable idea in Britain, but that's just not true. Yes, we have a freedom of information law, but you try to get information from the authorities using the FOI. They will time you out always. They know you have a deadline. They know they can send you a frivolous rejection by the time you appeal it all the way to the ICO. That's by 18 months before you might get this information that you had a legal right to. 18 months. Who can afford that? Who can afford to stick around for that long for a situation that the authorities know the news cycle will move on from? These are the things which has created this culture of journalism that has forgot that it's for the people and is entirely now for the benefit of the authorities. The way that journalists treat official word frightens me. Where do you get the confidence in this official word? Whether it's a leaked report, whatever is coming out of the government, whatever is coming out of politicians, it is just verbatim quoted, and with the he said, she said framing, which allows journalists to basically be lazy. They said this, and I'm quoting them directly, so therefore my piece is accurate. True, but is your piece true? You know what I mean? Is this the truth? Or are you just helping propagate absolute nonsense, which we'll discover 6, 7 months, maybe a year, 2 years later was nonsense, but it doesn't matter now. It's lost that political value. They always just will trust authorities as their stories come from authorities, the angles come from authorities, and they will just repeat that because they neither have the skills nor the resources to be able to do something otherwise. So, you need to be able to shake information loose outside of this conveyor belt that just goes from whether it's Parliament to Fleet Street over there or whatever the equivalent is here in America. You need to somehow, first of all, disrupt that. And when I say you, I mean media organizations outside of the mainstream. I mean these things that we're encouraging to sprout. Other ways to remember: number one, this is an organization that firmly believes we work for the public's interest, and that is entirely our motto. We will be covering stories that are in the public interest. We'll be trying to inform the public, and we are very kind of openly and bravely and clear that we represent the public. That's who we're biased for and against the authority. Number one. And number two, find a way to shake information loose outside of official sources. Don't trust official sources, no matter whatever relationship you have with them. Do not trust official sources. That's not who you're working for. Your persona is always, I work for the public, so I'll be skeptical of everything you give me. And that will help you, not just as a reporter, that will help you realize how opaque Britain is as a country. Try getting court documents, court files in Britain. It's ridiculous. Try getting public judgment reports in Britain. Try any word that should have been allowed. Like if you were in the lobby of a courtroom, you could have heard it, you could have written it down, you could have reported on it. But now that the court case is finished, you try getting those documents. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous the exercise you have to go through to convince public officials to give you public information that the public have access to. It's wild. If more journalists were doing that practice that way, not just relying on official sources or handouts, but actually doing the work, and in that time helping the public realize the frustrations, how hard it is to shake that information loose. I remember there was people had had a right to, I guess, be underwhelmed by the way the Trojan Horse Affair ends, because we don't find a definitive conclusion to some of the primary questions. Sure, but reflect on that in a different way. Two investigative reporters ran at this story full time for a number of years. For a number of years, and they still couldn't get the information which they believe, and hopefully you believe, you have a right to know. Ultimately, they have to report what they managed to accumulate, but just recognize how hard it is to get information that you have a right to know. And that's why most investigative stories might end without a conclusion, because we don't have the access that we believe we should for the benefit of the public. So I think, like, I would encourage, just a real kind of like shattering and differentiating of like the media ecosystem in Britain and elsewhere. I would encourage people to remember the old school practice of journalism, where you were gunning for authorities for the benefit of the public. And then in doing that, bring the public along in the journey, help them realize how hard it is to do proper journalism, and help them be part of the campaign to kind of open up these dark spaces where accountability lives and exists, Anyway, that's my little screed.
but like, I think there's so much in there, and I think I wanted to come back to, I mean, in a sense, that thing about being biased towards the public, because it comes back to this thing about, the personal and the political. And in a way, for me, personal is the wrong thing here, because actually this is a collective enterprise for me. And in a way, part of the problem at the root of journalism is ego, frankly. It's actually, so you talked about the hero's story at the beginning, Deb, and I actually don't think the Trojan Horse is a hero's story at all. And actually what it is what's really kind of, I suppose, incentivized in British journalism is people with certainty. So the people who get the big money are the columnists, frankly, the people who bring the most of themselves to it, and the people who have real certainty. They say, this is the way the world works. And actually, for me, journalism is asking the questions. So Hamza started with a question, who the hell wrote this letter, right? That's just a question you wanted answered. Whereas everyone else was like, we know. Yeah, so that's why we're ignoring that, because I understand how this shit works, basically, because I'm cleverer than you. That's really where that comes from. I'm cleverer than you. I understand how this shit works. And I think we've got to get back to, being a collective question asking or sense making exercise. And Hamza's exactly right. The purpose of journalism has become so disentangled from the practice of journalism, or vice versa. The practice has become so disentangled from the purpose that it's become all about ego and heroes, and I'm the star reporter. And that's not it. And I really love, so City Bureau in Chicago, who some of you will have heard of, in their mission statement, they have, we don't have heroes. Yeah, we don't have heroes, because this is a collective enterprise. And things like awards recognize one individual when nothing gets made individually. And actually, the things I'm most proud of, even when I worked at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, are the things which were done with communities as co-created investigation. And actually, they were the most impactful things as well. And the final thing on, that I think the idea, I mean, Hamza's exactly right about, that kind of access stuff. People are seen as good journalists because they get leaks from senior politicians. Now, that's not because you're a good journalist. That's because you're an open vessel who's just going to repeat verbatim what you're told. But that's held up as like, oh, they get good stories. No, they get nonsense and they repeat it. And I always say to people, you can either have people trust you, or you can use anonymous sources. You can't have both. And people hate that when I say that in journalism. But it's like, it's obvious to people. It's like, how can I trust that if it's from an anonymous source? Whereas, again, in a rigorous journalism world, that would be anathema. But it's not. It's like, that's good journalism.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're describing about a collective process. I mean, yeah, I agree. I don't think the Trojan Horse Affair is framed as a heroic journey. I finally listened to the first series of Serial in the last few months, and I think that in some ways set the tone and the genre for a lot of the podcasts that followed it. And to me, that did really frame it as like, is the journalist going to find out the answer to this question, rather than, as you're saying, Hamza, like, are we actually going to reach a truth which could address an injustice? And I think it's also a question of, if you're seeing it as collective, then you're acknowledging that you're not detached. You are actually attached to a set of people. You're attached to a community. And also that those attachments mean that you're not coming in cold to things. In fact, if you were coming in cold, you're the wrong person to tell the story. I mean, that point in the podcast, Hamza, when you list all the people that you never believed, it's like, that's because you weren't starting from scratch. You were coming actually with a high level of knowledge about this story, including a high level of knowledge about what the impact of this had been on a whole set of people. And yeah, it's almost like there's a traditional model of journalism where if you're coming in and you're like, I have no opinion on this because I don't know anything about it, you're actually a better person to tell the story than a person who has a set of opinions because they already know something.
I know it is again. I struggle to imagine a field in which experience and background and history counts against you. Imagine I don't know. I used to be a doctor. I went to medical school. Okay, imagine I was reporting on I don't know, medical issues on the NHS. Does it not help that I have a background in medicine? Like, does it not help you as a member of the public think, well, if he's telling me that he's concerned about something, or if he's telling me that something's untoward or wrong, who better than him who's actually worked in NHS, walked around these hospitals, has colleagues and friends in the hospitals? Who better than him to tell me what's normal and what's not normal? But generally speaking, as a journalist, if you're a Muslim and you're reporting on a Muslim issue, how dare you? How dare you have the audacity to think you'd be believed or trusted? You're a Muslim by nature. You are now part of the problem. It's incredible. It's incredible that that's the outlook. And that's the thing which, like I say at the beginning of the Trojan Horse Affair, that's the thing I was trying to mitigate against. That's the thing that I was trying to kind of cower and hide from. God forbid someone recognized I'm Muslim as part of this reporting, it would be game over. The whole thing would be finished. There'd be no point to me doing this exercise. They would instinctively not believe me. Why? Because I have more experience and knowledge in this area. Because I have more of an understanding of what's right and what's wrong as far as when it comes to these people, who is acting abnormal, who is acting suspiciously. Like, surely that is to your benefit and advantage for me to bring all that to this reporting. But apparently not. That's one thing. Secondly, any investigative reporter who pretends that they don't have some underlying suspicion that's driven them towards a story is, quite frankly, just being dishonest with you. Because why else are you doing a story? Most situations that we're covering will have some kind of official narrative attached to it, some official conclusion or summary, right? Your decision to go and to look at that, re-examine the situation, is a declaration that you don't believe in the official narrative. That's your declaration. Otherwise, why are you spending your time and money on this? Some official has told you what's happened here. Why are you looking into it? Unless you don't believe it. So that's the standing from which you're coming from. If you're an investigative reporter and you're pitching a story to your editor, you're basically saying, here's what happened, but here's what I think might have happened. Or here's what I believe I could find. Or let me have a look at this for 3 months because I'm a bit confused about certain details or whatever. Something's not making sense to you. That is an underlying suspicion that you carry to your story. I'm not saying that's the underlying suspicion that you religiously hold on to during your reporting if it's not substantiated. If the facts start supporting your suspicions, if the evidence starts accumulating and starts pointing to something nefarious or untoward, what you're supposed to now pretend that that's not what you were looking to find or looking for or like had foreshadowed. Of course it was. Of course it was. So then someone will say, well, then you're only looking at certain parts because you had a suspicion and you look for evidence to prove that suspicion. First of all, I wouldn't be able to find any evidence to prove my suspicion if there wasn't some evidence to prove my suspicion, right? So by nature, I've already done my job as a reporter by discovering something new that has upheld a suspicion of mine. Now, if you're telling me that's an incomplete story, build on that then. Go build on that. Go to Birmingham, do some more reporting on the Trojan Horse, tell me what I overlooked or what I didn't discover or I didn't find. But you can't just dismiss the work that I have done because that is supported by facts and evidence. So at worst, you can accuse me of presenting an incomplete story, in which case, go finish it. Go finish it. But you can't just say, no, I don't like this person because he told me that he has suspicions about this, and actually he found evidence to support his suspicions, but now I'm just going to ignore him because he's Muslim. That's confusing. That makes no sense to me. And, you know, that's kind of, if you look at the aftermath of the Trojan Horse Affair, like, how has it largely been dealt with by the British press, if at all, to be honest? Like, how has it been taken up? No. I mean, you know, in kind of like a flippant summary, nah. It's a nah. Okay, so 8 hours of podcasting, full of facts and evidence, full of supporting kind of material, full of possible leads for you to go, you know, go continue this reporting on. Nah. Why? I don't like this. Okay, but that doesn't matter. That for me is where you're exposing yourself in terms of how impartial and objective you are. I don't care if you like this or not. That's not the point. Is this worthy of looking into? Yes, yes. So you know, it's really weird. Are any of these facts unsupported? No. Is any of this evidence made up? No. So what don't you like about this? I just don't like it. Okay, but that is not your job. That's not your job. You're a journalist, man. You have to go to your work. So any investigative reporter has suspicions they must do. Otherwise, why would they fixate on a situation and go spend years looking at something? Again, this work takes time. Are you telling me this entire time you have no idea what's happening? No idea what you might find? You're just stabbing in the dark and hoping for the best. If an investigative reporter worked like that, they would never be trusted by any editor. They would never be funded. You're asking for a tremendous amount of resources to go do your work. You better have some underlying idea about where this might be going. And apparently that's not what we're supposed to say to the public. We're not supposed to reveal that bit, that like at one point I had my suspicions. It's weird.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our event. So just to maybe finish on a little bit of a positive note, I was wondering if each of you could say, especially thinking about this idea of collectives, like where do you see the kind of groups or collectives now who you think are doing this kind of the best kind of journalism, or the journalism that is pointing away towards the future?
Sure, I can go. So, well, I think there's lots of change, like really radical change coming down the line. I mean, we're already seeing, you know, the development of large language models, generative AI. That will be able to do a lot of basic journalism very quickly. And actually, journalists and I'm not unhappy about that. I think actually that's a positive thing, because there are basic facts which can be better relayed by a machine than by a human being, precisely because we do come with those kind of biases. So even the way we select an article, or how we write a basic article, is kind of overshadowed by biases. And I've done a lot of kind of research on that. But actually, it comes back to then, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, what is our USP as human beings that we can do better than machines? And that is connection, collaboration, care, all those sorts of things. And in some ways, that's going to require some different skills for quite a lot of journalists, because there's quite a lot of journalists who have very few skills in that area. But there are lots who do. And I see really positive stuff. I mean, I've been working on and off on various things with the New Humanitarian, for example, the last couple of years. And they, for example, took very seriously a notion of decolonizing their journalism. And they did the really hard work. And as I talked about, this is about having different people, having different perspectives. That's how this stuff changes. And they took that very, very seriously. And there are lots of, my kind of journalistic heroes are Greater Govanhill magazine in Glasgow. And that's someone who set up a community magazine that's multilingual, has stories written by regular people who just happen to live in Govanhill. And I'm a member of Greater Govanhill. I pay my subscription. And even though I live 175 miles away or something, I feel part of that community, because they are universal stories told through the lens of a local magazine. But they are stories that connect with me in a way that stories written by, frankly, a bunch of white men in London do not connect with me, because they at their heart is a root of a different kind of truth, essentially, about what the world looks like. So right now, they're sort of some of my journalistic heroes.
I don't have any gems to kind of like tell you guys about, because I'm still kind of getting familiar with the overlay journalism myself. I'm still, dabbling with pieces here and there. I mean, just a general rule that I would encourage you to apply is that any journalist who isn't slavishly just reproducing official word, just taking a lead from official statements and having that be the centerpiece of their story. Any journalist who is trying to break out of that mold and trying to go beyond that and actually do some work and figure out the truth of it, I will support whatever publication they're working for, And so that's kind of what I look out for, is who informed this piece. And if it's just a bunch of officials who informed this piece, I largely don't care. And so I need any reporter who goes beyond the official word. I respect and I promote whatever publication they're working for. So, that's kind of how I will differentiate what I think is good or bad journalism.
Amazing. Thank you so much to both Shirish and Hamza. And can you mute Hamza? Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I think this is a really, really interesting conversation. And just to remind everyone watching, thank you so much for listening along. And we will be having our full day of events at the Media Democracy Festival on the 25th of March in London. If you are nearby and want to drop by, it would be great to see you there.